Okay. All right. Good evening. Tonight we're in the second of a three-part series. Last week the three-part series is about the Avot and about the concept of chosenness of the chosen people. Last week we spoke about Avraham. We spoke about why Avraham was chosen. And we also took a little bit of a virtual journey following Avraham in his footsteps on his entry into the land of Israel. We didn't go the full length of Avraham's journey. We started in the north in Shechem, which was the first place that he went to, and we got as far south roughly as Yerushalayim. We spoke about how Avraham didn't actually enter the city of Yerushalayim at all, at least not that we're told about in the Torah. We spoke about the events of Avraham's life, and we also spoke about an idea that was popularized by the Ramban, although it has earlier sources as well, which is known by the title Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim, that all the things that happen to the Avot, all the stories that we read about them, are there in order to lay out for us the patterns of how things are meant to happen in the future. We saw some examples of that with Avraham even. We saw how his entry into the land of Israel in the area of Shechem was paralleled by the command that Bnei Israel were obligated to do when they entered the land later on under the leadership of Yoshua. And we spoke about how certain patterns of struggles that Avraham had play out throughout history, even in our own times as well. But we didn't follow Avraham on his entire journey, because Avraham continued further south and spent most of his time in Eretz Yisrael in two places. We spoke about Shechem, Beit El, and a little bit about Yerushalayim. But Avraham spent most of his time further south in the cities of Hebron and in Beersheba. And what we're going to do tonight, and Bezrat Hashem also next week, is continue following Avraham, but we're going to play with the chronology a little bit. And as we follow Avraham and his journey further south, we're also going to talk about tonight about his son Yitzchak and the next step in the process of creating the chosen people, because Avraham had more than one son, as we know, and it's Yitzchak who was chosen. And we're going to talk about what Yitzchak represents and what Yitzchak added to the picture, why it wasn't enough to just have a nation come from Avraham, why Yitzchak had to be chosen from among Avraham's other sons. And while we do that, we're going to get to the city of Hebron, which was Avraham's next stop. And I think we're going to see that Hebron and what it represents, and Yitzchak and what he represents, are sort of connected. And next week, in the final part of this series, God willing, we'll talk about Yaakov, the third of our forefathers, who was also chosen, as we recently read in the Torah, over his brother Esav. And then we'll get to the final stop on Grandpa Avraham's journey in Beersheba. And guess what? I think we'll see something about the message of Yaakov and the message of the city of Beersheba. Okay, so that's what we're going to do tonight. Tonight we're talking about Yitzchak and about Hebron. Both Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, all three of them spent a lot of time in Hebron and a lot of time in Beersheba. It's very interesting. And those two cities, I think, have a lot to tell us, as do the two descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I don't know if that made sense, but hopefully by the end of this talk tonight, and certainly by the end of next week's, I hope it will. Okay. Before we get into anything, though, we need to ask a fundamental question. Why was this process of bechira, of selecting, why was it even necessary? Last week, we explained the concept of a chosen people. We saw that Avraham was chosen for a reason. We saw that he was given a mission, and the mission was described as v'nivrechu v'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama. Abraham's mission was to bring God's blessings to the entire world. And I shared with you my philosophy that I've developed further in my Am Levadad series on my website, which is that the main blessing that Avraham was meant to bring to the world was the message of monotheism, the belief in one God, the understanding that there's one God, and everything that comes from that. And therefore that Avraham was chosen to be the founder of a nation that would have a very unique history and that would bring those messages and ultimately those blessings to the entire world. That Avraham began to do in his lifetime, and ultimately history showed that that nation did come into existence. And again, on my website, you can see more about this, but I think by now it's clear that the historical role that Avraham's descendants were meant to fill in the world is well along the way to completion. But it didn't go from Avraham to the chosen people. Avraham had many children. In fact, Avraham was even told his name Avraham means Av Hamon Goyim, that he's the father of many nations. And for some reason, therefore, there needed to be multiple children, and only one of those children was chosen. And particularly, we know that Avraham and his wife Sarah couldn't have children for a very long time. And eventually, as we know, at the age of when Avraham was 86 years old and Sarah was 76, she said, you're not having any children. Take my servant, my maidservant Hagar, and take her as a second wife, and hopefully you'll have a child from her. And of course, that actually happened. And Avraham had a child called Yishmael. And we read a few weeks ago that when Hashem came to Avraham at the end of Parshat Lech Lecha, and he told Avraham, look, Sarah's going to have a child too. Avraham said, Lu Yishmael yichyeh lefanecha. I've been blessed with a child. I love my child Yishmael. That's enough for me. And Hashem said, no, you're going to have a child from Sarah. And ultimately, we know that Yishmael was sent out of the house. He was kicked out. And Avraham was told, Ki beYitzchak yikarei lecha zera, that only Yitzchak will be your real descendants, even though you have many descendants, but ultimately the chosen people, the mission for which you were chosen, that's only going to come from Yitzchak. And Avraham married another wife after Sarah died called Keturah, and he had children with her too. And there's also a mention of Pilagshim, of concubines, which maybe also refers to Keturah. And according to one opinion, Hagar and Keturah and the Pilagshim are all one person. But according to the simple reading, he had multiple wives and concubines and had many children, but he sent them all away. Avraham had many children and assumedly had some impact on those children, and that's part of his impact on the world, but they were all sent away, and only Yitzchak was chosen. And perhaps we can suggest that the reason for that is simply that nobody else was worthy, that, Avraham they all could have been part of Avraham's chosen nation, but none of them were worthy except for Yitzchak. It's difficult to say that, though, because if we read, I have a PowerPoint, but I didn't put this pasuk on it, so I'll just read it to you. When before Yitzchak was even born, Avraham was told that he's going to have another son, and Avraham responded. I'm reading from Bereishit, Perek Yud Zayin, pasuk Yud Chet. Vayomer Avraham el ha'Elohim, Lu Yishmael yichyeh lefanecha. As we said before, if only Yishmael would live, that's enough for me. And Hashem told him, Vayomer Elohim, Aval Sarai ishtecha yoledet lecha ben. You're going to have a child. V'karat et shmo Yitzchak. He's told what to name the child. And then he's told, Vakimoti et briti ito levrit olam lizaro acharav. And I'm going to fulfill my brit with him. In other words, before Yitzchak was born, Avraham was told that this is the child who's going to be the one to carry out your covenant. And next week we'll see something very similar, even more dramatic, when it came to Yaakov and Esav. Rivka was pregnant. Neither of them had been born yet. And she was experiencing difficulties in her pregnancy, and she went to seek out God, and she received the prophecy that Shnei Goyim bevitnech, that you have not just two sons in your womb, not just twins, but you have two nations in your womb. In other words, what I'm driving at is we cannot assume or understand that the idea of chosenness was a decision based on the actions of the children who were born. It seems to have been predetermined that Yitzchak would be chosen from among all of Avram's other children, even before Yitzchak was born. And similarly, that Yaakov would be chosen above Esav before either of them was born. So we're going to have to try to understand what this is about and what the purpose of this is. And hopefully tonight and ultimately really next week, I hope to do that with you. Okay. So let us now, I will share my screen. Okay, I hope this worked. Okay, if you don't see that, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that everybody sees it. Okay. Let's take a look at a few psukim that tell us that Yitzchak was the one who was chosen. We're told here, and this is from Parshat Toldot, after Yitzchak was born, and even after, I'm sorry, this is not from Parshat Toldot. I'm sorry. This is, I'm sorry. No, I was right the first time. This is from Parshat Toldot. After Yitzchak grew up, after Yitzchak was almost offered as a korban, which was clearly a very formative experience in Yitzchak's life, we find something very interesting about Yitzchak. Most of the time that Yitzchak appears in the Torah, we have, first of all, less about Yitzchak than we do about Avraham, and much less than we do about Yaakov. And almost all the stories we have about Yitzchak, he appears as the secondary character in the story. In other words, in the early stories of his life, his role, the story is really about Avraham. It's about Yitzchak too, but Yitzchak is there as Avraham's son. For example, perhaps the most important example of this is the Akedah. The story of Akedat Yitzchak is really a story about Avraham. It shows us Avraham's great emunah, Avraham's great faith. Obviously, Yitzchak has a role in there too, but he's the secondary character. He's the son. Later on, we're going to get to the brachot that were given to Yaakov and to Esav, and Yaakov tricking Yitzchak into giving him the bracha. There, Yitzchak plays a role in the story, but Yitzchak is there really as Yaakov's father. There's only one parak in the entire Chumash which is about Yitzchak himself, not about his father and he as the son, and not about his son and him as the father, but about Yitzchak himself. And that's this parak Chavav. We're told that there's a famine in the land, and Yitzchak needs to leave his home where he was living because he couldn't eat, he couldn't support himself. And so he seems to have been on the way down to Egypt. And that should sound very familiar to us because his father, Avraham, also did that, right? Remember when there was a famine, Avraham went down to Egypt. And Hashem told him, Al tered Mitzrayim. No, don't go down to Egypt. Do something a little different than your father did. Shchon ba'aretz asher amar elecha, gur ba'aretz hazot, v'yeh imcha v'avarechecha. You, unlike your father, cannot leave Eretz Yisrael. Your father Avraham left Eretz Yisrael. He also wasn't born in Eretz Yisrael. Your father Avraham left when there was a famine, but you're different. You were born in the land of Israel, and you have to stay in the land of Israel. Gur ba'aretz hazot. You, Yitzchak. And we'll see, of course, that this was not true of his son Yaakov either. Avraham was born outside the land. Avraham left the land at one point. Yaakov was born in the land, but left the land twice and spent much of his life in exile. But Yitzchak was born, lived, and died in the land of Israel, never stepped foot outside the land. And the one time that we see he was perhaps considering doing so, he was prohibited from doing so. You, Yitzchak, must stay in the land, and I will bless you. And look at this pasuk. Ki lecha ulizaracha etenet kol aratzot ha'el. You will, and your descendants will receive all of these lands. That's almost an exact quote from the promise that was made to Avraham. Here we see specifically that the promise made to Avraham is being passed to Yitzchak. Vakimoti et hashvuah asher nishbati lavraham avicha. Through you, I will fulfill the promise that I made to your father Avraham. Okay, so here we have a very explicit reference to the idea that Yitzchak is in fact inheriting the bracha that was given to his father Avraham, and even more so in the next pasuk, V'irbeiti et zaracha kechochvei hashamayim. You will have as many descendants as the stars in the sky. Again, a direct repeat of what was told to Avraham. And your descendants will bring God's blessings to the entire world. All the things that were said to Avraham, that you're going to have many children, as many as the stars in the sky, and that you're going to inherit the land of Israel, all of these lands, and that you're going to be the one to bring God's blessings to the entire world. Those are all transferred here to Yitzchak, and he's told even that the oath that was given specifically to Avraham will in fact be given to him. So all of this is told here to Yitzchak. So we need to understand, again, why Yitzchak was necessary. If, after all, Avraham's promises are being transmitted to Yitzchak, Yitzchak is now going to be the progenitor of the chosen nation. What about all those other descendants that Avraham had? What makes Yitzchak different than Yishmael and the sons of Keturah? So we really, to do this properly, would have to read this entire parak, but I don't want to do that now because we only have limited time, and I do want to take you on some more steps of the virtual tour. I'm going to show you a video about Hebron as well. So I selected here just a few psukim from this parak, Parak Chafhei and Parak Chavav. It's actually a little bit of two prakim, but it's one story about Yitzchak. And I think we're going to see here something very, very strange. Look at this pasuk, for example, Parak Chafhei pasuk Yotet. This is the first pasuk in Parshat Toldot. And the pasuk begins, Ve'ele Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. These are the Toladot, which literally means the generations or the descendants. It can also mean like the legacy of. But usually, when we see that pasuk in the book of Bereishit, the concept of Toladot appears many times, actually 10 times in the book of Bereishit. And usually, when we have a pasuk like that, what we get are the descendants of that person. So, for example, Eila Toldot Noach, and shortly after that, we're told that Noach had 3 sons, Shem, Cham, and Yafet. Here we have a pasuk that says Eila or Toldot Yishmael, Toldot Esav. We get a list of descendants. Here we have a pasuk that says Eila Toldot Yitzchak. These are the descendants of Yitzchak ben Avraham. And I would expect that the next pasuk would tell me who Yitzchak's children were, but it doesn't. What does it say? Eila Toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. These are the descendants of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. Avraham holidet Yitzchak. Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak. First of all, a pasuk that says who Avraham's descendants were should start Eila Toldot Avraham. By the way, there is no such pasuk in the Torah. There's Toldot of almost every other important figure in Sefer Bereishit. We never have a pasuk about Toldot Avraham. Why that is for another time. But in any case, it shouldn't be that statement is in the pasuk about Yitzchak. And anyway, we're told it's Yitzchak ben Avraham. If Yitzchak is Avraham's son, then obviously Avraham gave birth to Yitzchak. Or didn't give birth to him, he's the father, but Avraham fathered Yitzchak. And yet this pasuk obviously means something. These are the toladot of Yitzchak ben Avraham. Avraham holidet Yitzchak. Avraham fathered Yitzchak. We'll come back to this in a minute. I think we'll understand. Let's look at these other psukim to understand what perhaps it means. The next pasuk, I'm skipping now. This tells us, this is after the pasuk that we read earlier when Yitzchak was told that he's not allowed to go down to Egypt. Instead, he went to the land of Gerar. The land of Gerar, I don't know if we mentioned it last week or not, but the land of Gerar, first of all, is a place that Avraham also was at. And the king there was called Avimelech. The land of Gerar is an area that's actually in all of our consciousness right now because it's pretty much the area that we call today the Gaza Strip, and perhaps a little bit of the area that we call Otef Aza, the area around the Gaza Strip today. Okay, so that's where Avraham went at one point, and now Yitzchak, who can't go down to Egypt in the famine, goes to that same place. So he goes to the same place his father went to, and he has a very similar experience. We may recall that when Avraham went to Gerar, what happened to him there? He said that his wife Sarah was actually his sister. They almost took her as a wife. Avimelech had a dream, and he came to Avram and he said, "Why did you do this to me?" And look at what happens. Something almost identical happens here to Yitzchak. Vayishalu anshe makom liishto. They ask who his wife is. Vayomer achotihi, and he says she's his sister. Because he's afraid. Ki yarei lemor ishti. He's afraid to say she's his wife. He's afraid that they would kill him because Rivka was very beautiful. Exactly the same thing that Avraham did. And just like Avraham, though, in the end, Avimelech found out, didn't violate Sarah, but got angry at Avraham. Same thing happened here. Avimelech found out that Yitzchak and Rivka were really married. And he got upset at Yitzchak. Why did you do this to me? It's almost a repeat of Avraham. And later on in the same parak we read, Vayelech misham Yitzchak, Vayicham benachal Grar, Vayeshev sham. He left Avimelech's area and he lived in the outskirts of Grar, in an area with more isolation. And what did he do there? Vayashov Yitzchak vayachpor et beirot hamayim asher chafru bimei Avraham aviv. Yitzchak went and dug wells, and not just any old wells. He dug the same wells that his father Avraham had dug. Vayisatmum plishtim. Those wells, in the meantime, had been stopped up by the plishtim, who didn't want those wells to exist. Acharei mot Avraham. Avraham dug wells. The plishtim, when Avraham died, undug, basically. They sealed off those wells. For whatever reason, they did that. And Yitzchak now goes and redigs the same wells that his father dug. Vayikra lehem shemot. And he gives those wells names. Not names that he invents himself, but rather kashemot asher kara lehem aviv. Yitzchak gives the wells the same names that Avraham had given them. And a little later in that parak, we read something else that reminds us of Avraham. Yitzchak goes further away from there, and he settles in the area called Be'ersheva, which was already outside. It was near, but outside the territory of Grar. And at some point, Avimelech, the king of Grar, who has the same name as the king of Grar in the days of Avraham, whether it's actually the same Avimelech who outlived Avraham and is still king in the next generation, or whether, as I think might be a little bit more likely, this is not the same Avimelech, this is Avimelech's son, who also takes the name Avimelech. But he goes to see Yitzchak, just as the original Avimelech went to see Avraham in the same area of Beersheba. And he brings with him his Sar Tzava, his military chief, whose name is Pichol. And again, the original Avimelech's military chief was Pichol. So again, it's either the same man or a different generation, but he has the same name and the same title. So just like Avraham was living in Beersheba and was visited by Avimelech, the king of Grar, and his chief of staff, his military chief, Pichol, Yitzchak is living now in the area of Beersheba, and he's visited by Avimelech, the king of Grar, and the military chief, Pichol. And why did they come? The original Avimelech told Avraham he wants to make a treaty with him, and here we're told the same thing. Ra'o ra'inu, ki haya Hashem imach, v'nichrata brit imach, and we want to make a treaty with you. And eventually we're told they make a treaty, and they swear to each other. And when Avraham made an oath to Avimelech, in commemoration of this, the place was named Be'ersheva. And now, even though it's already named Be'ersheva, they name it again. Vayikra utashiva al kain shem ha'ir Be'ersheva ad hayom hazeh. What am I trying to show you here? I told you a few minutes ago that almost nothing we read about Yitzchak in the Torah is really about Yitzchak. Yitzchak appears first as Abraham's son, later as Yaakov's father. There's one parak in the Torah, or one parshiah in the Torah, one section, where we're told the story of Yitzchak's life himself. And basically, Yitzchak's life seems to be a repeat of Avraham. And how is that section introduced? Eile toldot Yitzchak ben Avraham. This is the generations. This is the legacy. This is the accomplishment of Yitzchak ben Avraham, the son of Avraham. What was that accomplishment? Avraham holidet Yitzchak. In other words, it seems that Yitzchak's whole purpose was to be his father's son. Yitzchak is not a great innovator. He's different than his father. For example, his father is allowed to leave the land of Israel, and he's not. Avraham was a charismatic person. Avraham was an iconoclast. Avraham came with ideas that for most people, as we spoke about last week, were completely revolutionary. Avraham came out to change the world. Yitzchak is different. Yitzchak appears to be a much more private person, appears to be a much more quiet person from what we can see. If you look at their roles in the Akedah, Avraham has to go through this incredible challenge of being willing to sacrifice everything and to sacrifice his son. But Yitzchak is the sacrifice. The rabbis refer to Yitzchak as Olat Mimah. And that experience of being placed on the altar must have had a profound impact on Yitzchak. The Kabbalists speak of Avraham as chesed and Yitzchak as gvura, and that this is not the time for a full analysis of that either, but gvura, which we can translate as strength or heroism, in rabbinic sources, is really mostly about controlling oneself. Ezehu Gibor, say the rabbis, who is the real hero? Hakoveshet Yitzro, someone who rules over himself and controls himself. So Yitzchak is about discipline. Yitzchak is about continuity. Yitzchak is about, yes, repeating what Avraham did. Avraham came on and changed the world, and he dug all these wells. And Avraham, there are people like that in history. There are people that are just incredibly charismatic and that make a huge impact. But often when those people finally leave the scene, whatever they accomplished doesn't last after them. Avraham digs wells, and the Plishtim fill them in. Yitzchak goes and redigs. He doesn't dig new wells. He digs the same wells. And he gives them the same names. And he goes back to Beersheba, and Avimelech makes another treaty, and he names Beersheba again. But what's Yitzchak about? Yitzchak is about permanence. Yitzchak is about holding on to the land of Israel, really holding on to it. Al Kain, Shem Ayir Beersheba Ad Hayom Hazeh. Avram named it Beersheba, and whatever that meant in his time, it meant in his time. And when we get to Beersheba, which we're only going to get to it next week when we talk about Yaakov, but we're going to flash back to Avram there also. We're going to see that Avram built something incredible in Beersheba, but it didn't last. Yitzchak renames Beersheba, and it's called Beersheba to this very day. Not only to the very day when the Torah was given, but even to this very day. There's still a place called Beersheba. So Yitzchak is about taking what Avraham did and making it permanent. That's what Yitzchak really represents. And interestingly enough, so now let's continue on our journey. We were maybe, you know what, maybe I should do, maybe let me flip back just to remind you where we were. Okay, I'm going to flip back. Last week, we'll go through these slides. These are the slides from last week really, really quickly. Okay, we started off in the area of Shechem. Okay, we were driving down Road 60. We started from Shechem. This is what's called Tzomet Tapuach. And then we passed Shiloh. We talked about Shiloh. We went further south. We were in Beit El. We spoke a lot about what Avram did in Beit El. And then we came to Yerushalayim. I showed you the places where Avram had been. First Shechem and then Beit El. And we're headed now between Beit El and Hebron. On the way, of course, is Yerushalayim. We talked about how Avram was not actually in Yerushalayim, but how he brought Yitzchak to the Akedah on Har HaMoriah, which at that time we said was just outside of Yerushalayim. Okay, now we're continuing south. So this is a picture of the modern road. Actually, this is an old picture. Those who live in Israel or those who've been here recently, if you've traveled to Gush Etzion, you now know that there are 2 tunnels and 2 bridges here. They're still under construction, actually. But this is the modern road that takes us from Yerushalayim south towards Hebron. Obviously, Avram didn't go over this bridge and through these tunnels. He went through the city of Beit Lechem, which is kind of bypassed by this road. And afterwards, he got to the area that today we call Gush Etzion. It wasn't called Gush Etzion then, but that's the area what we call the area between Yerushalayim and Hebron today. I am speaking to you from Gush Etzion. This picture is about 1 kilometer from where I'm currently sitting, the Gush Etzion junction. We're going to continue past Gush Etzion. Gush Etzion, by the way, may have been mentioned in this past week's parsha with Yaakov. One of the places Yaakov stopped was Migdal Eder, and according to some, Migdal Eder is right on this hill above the intersection here. But we're going to continue south from Gush Etzion, and we're going to get to a place that we call Hebron and Kiryat Arba, 2 places that are very close to each other. Today they refer to 2 separate places. In the Torah, it could be that Kiryat Arba and Hebron is actually one place, or maybe 2 aspects of the same place. In any case, this is where we're headed to, the city of Hebron. Now, I'm going to show you a video in a few minutes that I made in Hebron, and we're going to take a little virtual tour around Hebron. Before I do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about Hebron. Obviously, the building that's in this picture is the site that is most commonly associated with Hebron. Of course, for those who may not be familiar, it says it here in Hebrew as well. This is the building that stands above the site that's known as Me'arat Machpelah. The building itself is a very significant one. It's It's 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years old. It was built by King Herod in the days of the second Beit HaMikdash, towards the end of the days of the second Beit HaMikdash. It's still completely intact and still completely standing over 2,000 years after it was built, and it's still in use. And when most people go to Hebron, that's what they want to do. They want to go there, and they want to pray at the graves of the Avot and the Imahot, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Sarah, and Rivka, and Leah. But just like I told you, that in biblical terms, Me'arat HaMachpelah is not actual. I said in biblical terms that Akedat Yitzchak, which is on the place that we now know as Har Habayit, the Temple Mount, the Hotel Maravi is built into the base of the Temple Mount. I told you that at that time this site was actually not in Yerushalayim; it was just near Yerushalayim. The same thing is true for Me'arat HaMachpelah. Me'arat HaMachpelah was not in Hebron; it was in the fields around Hebron. It's a burial cave. Burial caves were outside the city. The actual city of Hebron is up on a hill above Me'arat HaMachpelah, in a place that's today known as Tel Hebron, or sometimes it's called Tel Rumeida. And here you can see, if you go to this place, these steps that you see in this photograph have been excavated. And these steps and this wall are actually something like something to the effect of 4,500 years old. In other words, this wall and these steps are about 700 years before Avraham, and they were still in use in Avraham's time. These were the steps. This is the city wall from Avraham's time, and from long before Avraham as well. And these were the steps that led up to the city gate. If we could excavate under this modern road that's behind this fence here, we would probably find the remains of the original city gate. When Avraham entered the city of Hebron, it's from these steps that he entered the city. So Me'arat HaMachpelah is down below, outside the city. And I want to just return to these psukim for a minute. And I didn't give you the whole parsha here on the screen, but I do want to just say a few words about what Avraham did, and then we're going to watch at least the first part of the video. The purchase of Me'arat HaMachpelah is highly significant. It's told to us at the beginning of Parshat Chayei Sarah. And I think it tells us a tremendous amount about Avraham and about Hebron itself, and something that, as I said earlier, I think is going to connect to the message of Yitzchak. We're told at the beginning of Parshat Chayei Sarah, Vayihiyu Chayei Sarah 100 shana v'esrim shana v'sheva shanim shnei Chayei Sarah. Sarah lived 127 years. Batamot Sarah b'Kiryat Arba hi Hebron. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba. Vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota, and Avraham comes and he cries for Sarah and he mourns for her, and now he needs to bury her. And Avraham has a problem at this point. Avraham needs to bury his wife, but he does not own any land. And so he has to go and try to procure a piece of land. And as we all know, and as we'll read in a few moments, he went up these steps, and he spoke to the people in Hebron and asked for a piece of land. But the situation that Avraham found himself in here must have been very, very frustrating for him. Avraham at this point was 137 years old. He came into Canaan at the age of 75. That's over 60 years earlier. 60 years. And he was told, all this land will be yours. And here it is 60 years later, and he can't even bury his wife because he doesn't own anything. And that connects to the paradox we spoke about last week, about how Eretz Yisrael is just so hard to hold on to. And that seems, as we mentioned last week, to have been built into the system. So on the one hand, this must have been very frustrating for Avraham. On the other hand, he understood that he has here a real opportunity. And so we're told, and I think I put some of these psukim here. This is the psukim at the end. We'll get to these psukim in a minute. We're told that Avraham goes up these steps and he speaks to the people. And it says the following. He speaks to the people of Hebron, and he says to them, Ger v'toshav anochi machem I am a stranger here, even though I live here. I'm really an immigrant here, a ger. I'm a toshav. I live here, but I'm a ger. But I'm an immigrant, and I have a problem. I need to bury my wife. Tenuli achuzat kever imachem. Give me an achuzat kever. Give me a burial estate. And the word achuzah, as you'll see in the video, I think is highly significant. Because achuzah comes from the word le'echoz. It means to hold on to something. Avraham understood that if he manages to buy a piece of land now to bury his wife in, that will be his first real connection to the land. And that by doing so, he'll be planting roots deep in the land that his descendants for all time will be able to le'echoz, they'll be able to hold on to. And the Bnei Chet, the residents of Hebron, initially don't fully understand apparently what Avram's asking them, or if they do, they pretend they don't. They said to him, oh, you need to bury your wife? No problem. Nasi Elohim ata b'tochenu, you're a very, very respected person here. B'mivchar kvareinu kvoret meitecha. Choose the best grave that we have to bury your wife. Ish mimenu et kivro lo yichle mimcha mikvor meitecha. Nobody among us will hold back his grave from you. You can have any grave you want. Pick it, and it's yours. On the surface, it looked like they were very, very generous, and they gave him exactly what he asked for. But if you read carefully, there's a nuance. He asked for achuzat kever. He asked for an estate, something that he can hold on to. And they offered him a kever. They offered him a grave, but not an achuzat kever. And without going through the whole parak, Avraham continually inserts the word achuzah. I want to have an achuzat kever. And ultimately, Ephron, the owner of the cave, says to him, oh, you can take it for free. And Avram says, no, I want to pay for it. He says, oh, wow, what's 400 silver shekels between me and you? 400 silver shekels was a lot of money, way more than the field was worth. As soon as Avraham hears the price, immediately he doesn't negotiate. He starts weighing out the money. He pays this exorbitant price. But ultimately, and now I'll go back to those psukim that I put here, Vayakom sdei Ephron asher b'machpelah asher lifnei Mamre. Ultimately, that cave, the cave of Machpelah, hasadeh ve'amiara asher bo v'chol ha'etz asher basadeh, the cave, but also the whole field and all of the trees, was given LaAvraham lemikna le'nei b'nei chet b'chol ba'ei sha'ar iro. In front of all those who stood at the top of those steps in the city gate, they all saw it and they all acknowledged it. And then we're told that Avraham buried Sarah there. Look at this last pasuk. Vayakam asadav yamara shebo leAvraham la'achuzat kever me'et b'nei chet. So at that moment, Avraham, at the moment of his greatest sorrow, Avraham had the ability to begin, finally, process of actually inheriting the land. And now, let's watch the first part of this video that I made a number of years back on behalf of Michlelet Herzog. Me'arat HaMachpelah. There's something about this place that attracts people like a magnet. Sometimes over 100,000 Jews come here on a single day. Other than the Kotel HaMa'aravi, there's probably no place in the entire world that has such a draw. Why? What is it about this place? I'm Rabbi Alan Haber, and today we're in Hebron. The building behind me is very impressive in its own right. Built over 2,000 years ago, it is still 100% intact and still in use. But that's not why people come. They come not for the building, but for what's inside, or more precisely, what's underneath. The graves of the Avot and Imahot, the graves of our parents, our fathers and our mothers. It all began when Sarah Imenu died. Avraham needed a place to bury her, and for some reason, he was very interested in this particular cave, in this particular field. At that time, the fields and the caves were outside the city. The city of Hebron was up there on the mountain.
And in order to get the cave, he needed to go up there to the city gate, where all the people used to gather, in order to find the owner of the cave and try to negotiate. This wall and these steps were built a very long time ago, around 4,500 years ago. And that means that when Avraham came here, some 3,800 years ago, they were already ancient. These are the steps that led to the city gate. And therefore, assumedly, it's on these very steps that Avraham walked when he ascended to try to find the people that he needed to speak with. And we read in the Torah in Parshat Chayei Sarah, Vayakum Avraham me'al pnei meito, Vaydaber al bnei chet lemor, ger v'toshav anochi imachem, tnu li achuzat kever imachem, v'yakbera meiti milfanai. Avraham asked for achuzat kever, for a burial plot or a burial estate, and they offered him kever. They offered him a grave. Avraham says, if that's what you're offering, I'd like something very specific. He asks for this field and the cave known as Merat Machpelah that belonged to a man named Ephron ben Sochar. And eventually, after a lengthy negotiation and discussion, he convinces them to sell him the field, and he agrees to pay an exorbitant price. Why did he want that particular field in that particular cave? The Zohar tells us that that cave known as Merat Machpelah is located directly opposite the entrance to Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, and that the very first people, Adam and Chava, were buried there. Also, the word Chevron in Hebrew is related to the word Chibur, which means connection. And the word Achuzah, which means a plot or an estate, is related to the word Le'echoz, which means to hold on to something. And when you put all that together, it seems that Avraham understood he was doing something very significant here. There's the cave in the valley below. Avraham spent part of his life here in Hebron, and eventually he was buried there next to his wife Sarah. Also his son Yitzchak and grandson Yaakov lived here in Hebron, and they and their wives were buried there as well. Am Yisrael went into exile in Egypt, and that also began from here. When Yaakov sent his son Yosef to meet his brothers, it says, Vayishlachehu me'emek Hebron. And from there he went to Shechem, and from there they went down to Mitzrayim. Hundreds of years of slavery in Mitzrayim. They came back here to Eretz Yisrael. And then again, Hebron was the first place. When Moshe Rabbeinu sent spies to check out the land before they even were ready to come in, it says, Vaya'alu b'Negev, vayavo ad Hebron. They ascended to the Negev, but vayavo ad Hebron, but he came to Hebron, implying that only one of the spies actually came to Hebron. And from here our rabbis deduced that it was Kalev ben Yefuneh who came here to Hebron, separating himself from the others to go and pray at the graves of the Avot. And indeed, we are told in the book of Yoshua that Kalev himself was the one who eventually came here and conquered Hebron and turned it into a city for Am Yisrael. A number of decades ago, when they were building this modern apartment building for Jewish families who live here in Hebron, before building the building, they did an archaeological excavation on the land. And they found here amazing things from our history. This pit that we have here was used for storing grain. And based on the style in which it's built, we can tell that this is from the days of Yoshua bin Nun. In other words, this is part of the city that Kalev ben Yefuneh built here in Hebron. Generations later, David HaMelech, before turning Yerushalayim into the capital of the Jewish people forever, David began his reign here in Hebron. He ruled in Hebron for 7 years before capturing Yerushalayim. And we need to ask, why did David start here? Perhaps at least part of the answer is because David wanted to connect to that chibur, to that achuzah that Avraham had planted here all the way at the beginning of our history. The few Jews that did remain here in Eretz Yisrael.
Okay, I'll show you the end of the video in a minute, but I just want to pause in the middle and think about the two things we just spoke about. Okay, you just saw here what we spoke about before we turned on the video, right? The idea that Abraham was gaining an achuzah And in the video, I also mentioned that the very word Chevron comes from the word chibur, which means connection. And that Chevron, therefore, really represents our deep connection with Eretz Yisrael. And again, Maseh Avot Siman Labanim, we see how that played out later on in history. According to the rabbinic account, it's Kalev ben Yefuneh who went to Chevron. And when the other spies were plotting to basically stay out of the land of Israel, and Kalev, who was fighting to go into the land of Israel, he needs to draw inspiration. Where does he go? He goes to Chevron. Chevron is the connection to the land of Israel. And Kalev ben Yefuneh is the one who ultimately conquers and settles Chevron. And David HaMelech, the dynasty, the eternal Davidic dynasty that's going to lead to Yemot HaMashiach, starts in Chevron, before Yerushalayim. David could not conquer Yerushalayim until he first ruled in Chevron. Chevron is the roots. Chevron is the chibur, the connection. Chevron is the achuzah, the thing that we hold on to. By the way, there's a fascinating Mishnah in Masechet Tamid that tells us that in the Beit HaMikdash every day, you're not allowed to bring the morning offering, the morning sacrifice, the Korban Tamid Shal Shachar, until it's daytime, until the sun has come up. And so Mishnah tells us that they had this tower outside the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, where a Kohen would climb up to the top of the tower and look out to the eastern horizon to see when it would start to get light out. It was still the dead of night when he went up there, and he waited for the morning to come. And when he would begin to see the first brightening of the sky, he would scream out, Barkai, which means that the sunlight is breaking forth. And somebody down at the bottom would ask him, He'ir Pnei Kol HaMizrach, is it yet at the point that the entire eastern sky is lit up? And only when he would say, Hen, yes, it is, they would ask him the following question. Ad Shebechevron, do you see the rays of the sun lighting up the sky in the south over Chevron? And when he would say, Hen, yes, they could then bring the Korban. And many see that Mishnah also as highly symbolic. In fact, if you go to Me'arat HaMachpelah today, and you go to pray inside Me'arat HaMachpelah, there's a number of different areas where you can daven, but like the main shul, so to speak, in the middle of the Jewish part of Me'arat HaMachpelah, there's an Aron Kodesh, a beautiful Aron Kodesh, modern Aron Kodesh that somebody donated, and on the Aron it actually has that Mishnah, He'ir Pnei Kol HaMizrach Ad Shebechevron, because there's something deeply symbolic about that. Yerushalayim couldn't be built until David first ruled in Chevron. And ultimately, when the Beit HaMikdash is standing, you cannot bring the Korban until the sun comes up. You can't bring the Korban in Yerushalayim until the sun comes up in Chevron. So Chevron represents the foundation and the roots. And that's exactly what Yitzchak represents, if you think about what we said earlier. Yitzchak is all about taking what Avraham did and making it permanent. Digging the wells that Avraham dug again, but this time making them permanent. Naming the city of Beersheba again, but this time they're having it last. Yitzchak is about that permanence. Avraham bought Me'arat HaMachpelah in order to bury Yitzchak's mother, Sarah. Yitzchak himself also lived in Chevron for much of his life and was buried in Me'arat HaMachpelah with his wife, Rivka. And of course, his son Yaakov and one of his wives, Leah, is also ultimately going to be buried there. And therefore, the Me'arat HaMachpelah, which is outside of Chevron, and the city of Chevron itself, which represents those roots planted deep in the ground, the chibur, the connection that Am Yisrael always has with Eretz Yisrael, brings the legacy of Yitzchak, the establishment and the permanence of Avram's mission, into an association with a concrete place, and that's Chevron. And it's not just in biblical times that was true. As we said earlier, Maseh Avot Siman Lebanim continues throughout all of history. And I want to now show you just the last piece of the video here, where I'm currently standing here in this last scene outside this Beit Knesset that was built about 500 years ago. And you'll hear the story now.
Constantly tried to hold on to the achuzah that was here in Chevron. This Beit Knesset that's behind me was built about 500 years ago by Sephardic Jews who came here after the expulsion from Spain. Eventually, it got the name Beit Knesset Avraham Avinu. And it got that name because of a story that the people who lived here used to tell. Many times things were very difficult here in Hebron. And one such year, when it was almost impossible here, there were so few people that they couldn't get a minyan for Yom Kippur. It was Erev Yom Kippur, and they only had 9 men. And they thought they might not even have a minyan for Yom Kippur until right before the Chag, an old man that nobody recognized came in, and he spent the Chag with them, the entire Yom Kippur. The minute Yom Tov was over, though, he disappeared before anyone could ask him who he was. And a few days later, he came to one of the people in the community in a dream and told them who he was. He was Avraham Avinu. I think that story is actually very deep because it says a lot about what life was like here in Hebron during those difficult years. It was almost impossible for the Jews to survive here. They didn't really have what it takes. But what kept them going? Avraham Avinu. The fact that they're living right here next to the graves of the Avot and the Imahot, that's what gave them strength to move on. And you too now can come to Hebron and visit and return to those ancient roots.
This last part of the video shows you some things we didn't get a chance to talk about. This is at the top of the hill. This is a two huge mikvaot and some archaeological, some industrial installations from the days of the second Beit HaMikdash. There was a Jewish community in Hebron then as well. This, of course, is the interior of Eretz Yisrael, the gravestones marking the fact that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were buried there. That stone that you saw there leads to the actual graves themselves. Here we have some drawings about Hebron. Okay. So we're basically out of time, but let's just summarize what we talked about tonight, and then we'll set the stage for the final part of this series, which Bezrat Hashem will be next week. We talked about how Avraham was chosen with this mission. We talked about the concept that the stories of the Avot set the patterns for later in history. We followed Avraham tonight from Beit El in Yerushalayim further south to Hebron. We talked about Yitzchak, who was chosen over Yishmael. We didn't yet discuss why Yishmael and the other sons needed to be sent away. We'll have to talk more about that next week. But we did see what Yitzchak adds to the picture that Avraham himself didn't have. Yitzchak being the one to take Avraham's life and basically just walk in his father's footsteps. Just take what his father did and turn it into something lasting. Simply take his father's legacy, live it in his own life, and pass it on to his son after him. And we saw that indeed the bracha and the chosenness that was granted originally to Avraham was passed on to Yitzchak. And we saw that a very similar idea characterizes the whole city of Hebron, which was where Avraham went next on his journey and where Yitzchak himself spent much of his life. In a place that's called Hebron from Chibur, and a place that's associated most prominently with the burial cave just outside of it, which is called an achuzat kever, something that you can hold on to. And we saw how that achuzah is what enabled Kalev ben Yefuneh to bring the people back to Eretz Yisrael. How Kalev, one of the first places in Eretz Yisrael that was conquered and settled, was Hebron, that was settled by Kalev, and you even saw there that grain storage pit that dates to the days of Kalev, the very beginning of Jewish Hebron, right there, and next to it a house from the days of David HaMelech and the kings who came after him. We talked about how the Davidic dynasty had to begin in Hebron before moving on to Yerushalayim. And we saw how even later in history, in the 16th century, the Jews who came there to Hebron, and that story, that legend that they told about Avraham Avinu coming to help them make the Minyan on Yom Kippur, which I think symbolizes the fact that Jews clung to Hebron even when we were in exile. Hebron is what became known as one of the 4 holy cities, even when almost no Jews were in Eretz Yisrael. There were a few places where Jews always tried to live whenever they could, at various points in history: Yerushalayim, Tveria, Tzfat, and Hebron. And for example, in the 16th century, and later on in the 18th century, and the 19th century, and today as well, it's a struggle, as I'm sure you know, to be in Hebron. But even today, there are Jews who tenaciously cling to Hebron and hold on to it, because their understanding is that without Hebron, we don't really have anything. There's one more city to visit, and that's Be'er-Sheva, which we already mentioned tonight, but we didn't really get into what Be'er-Sheva is all about. It's the final stop on Avraham's journey. And we're going to look at Bereishit next week. There's a video similar to this one, which we'll talk about, and we'll visit the ancient site of Bereishit. And we'll talk about the third Av, about Yaakov, and what makes Yaakov different from Avraham and Yitzchak, why we need another stage in the process of selection, why it's not enough to now say, okay, we have Avraham, we have Yitzchak, now let all of Yitzchak's sons become the chosen people. But as we, of course, know, and as we'll discuss next week, Yitzchak had two sons, and one of them had to be sent out also. We'll talk about those two sons that were sent away, Yishmael and Esav, and what they represent. And we'll talk about what Yaakov Avinu adds to the picture. And amazingly, I think we're going to see that just as Yitzchak's message connects very nicely with Hebron, Yaakov's message connects very nicely with Bereishit, and hopefully that will give us a full understanding of the process of chosenness and ultimately what that chosenness is all about. And next week's also Hanukkah, and maybe we'll be able to connect those messages a little bit to Hanukkah as well. So I wish you now already Chanukah Sameach, because Hanukkah starts, Bezrat Hashem, just in a few days. And I hope to see you next week for the final part of this series. Thank you very much.